Okay. Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our second lecture of the Lytle Lecture Series in 2018. We are extremely happy to have Professor Claire Tomlin from UC Berkeley as our Lytle speaker. And if you were there yesterday, she gave a wonderful lecture, public lecture on safe learning in robotics. And today, the talk will be more about technical details related to the background mathematics that goes into this research. A little bit about Claire. She received her PhD from UC Berkeley in '98, and she started a faculty position at Stanford right after that. She was a full professor at Stanford in aeronautics department until 2007 when she moved to UC Berkeley. She's now a full professor and holds the Charles Dezor Chair in Engineering at UC Berkeley in the EECS department. Her work is really amazing, as you saw yesterday, and you'll see more today, and has won a lot of awards. The most impressive, I think, is the MacArthur Fellowship, which is extremely prestigious award given in all kinds of areas, all the way from sciences and engineering to arts and sports and things like that. And she got it in 2006. She was named a MacArthur Fellow. She has also won the Ekman Award from the American Automatic Control Society, also one of the most prestigious awards in controls. Also the MIT TR100, the top 100 innovators rated by the MIT Technology Review. And she's a fellow of IEEE. She's also a fellow of American Institute in Medical and Biological Engineering for her work in the areas of biological system modeling using control theory. Most recently, in 2017, she won an award from IEEE in transportation technologies for her work on air traffic control. And so the awards go on, but I don't want to keep you any longer. Without further ado, please help me welcome Professor Claire Tomlin.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mariam, for the introduction, but also for being such a wonderful host and inviting me to come and give this series of Lytle lectures, which it's a great honor to do so, and just has been a wonderful visit here at the University of Washington over the past 2 days. Yesterday, I talked at a little bit of a higher level about two topics: reachability for safety control, so designing controllers to certify safety specifications of systems. And then I talked about how you would integrate machine learning into that safety-based control. Today, I think more appropriately for this EE department lecture, I chose to talk about I will talk about some more of the mathematical details of this reachability computation. There were a few questions about that yesterday, and really go into a little bit of the mathematics behind that. But I'm still going to keep the same motivation. I'm going to start, there'll be a little bit of overlap, presenting the motivation, the examples that we've been working on. And throughout the talk, I'm just going to present examples to demonstrate how we use this theory. Okay, so same motivation as yesterday, although I have a few different slides to show. I have been working for the past 25 years with NASA and the FAA on automating or figuring out what kinds of technologies which have been traditionally performed by human air traffic control in the civilian air traffic control system, what technologies and how one would try to automate those technologies. So I'm showing here in the background, it's a snapshot from one of NASA's online systems showing where aircraft are at a point over the United States at a given point in time. And then you saw in this little movie below, let's just go into that again. You can see again, this just shows over a few hour period, aircraft that are in and around this Oakland Center airspace. Air traffic control it's one of the most fascinating problems to work on. And it's a system which is very human-centric. Both air traffic controllers as well as pilots flying the aircraft. There's a lot of automation in aircraft. There's actually there's a lot of advisory, but very little automation in actual air traffic control. And the basic way it works is that aircraft will typically file flight plans with the FAA, indicating their origin, destination, the path they want to follow through waypoints across, for example, in the US. And the FAA, in their local centers will review this and then will provide a clearance to the aircraft or to the airline. It's typically, if it's an airline, it's done through the airline. And then when the flight is getting ready to take off, that plan will come into effect. And all the air traffic control centers that cover the airspace between the origin and destination will get an indication of about when that aircraft will come into that region, that center of airspace, and what its planned, what its filed flight plan is. At that time, basically, collision avoidance is not performed. The way collision avoidance is done is by generally restricting the number of aircraft that can be in any given region at any given time. For example, a larger center of airspace is divided into sectors. Each sector is controlled by a human air traffic controller on the ground, talking to pilots over radio channels. And each human controller gets up to about 12 aircraft in any 15-minute interval. So that's kind of the limit in terms of the cognitive capacity of a controller. And so the controller will accept control using the radio of the aircraft a little bit before that aircraft comes into their sector of airspace. They'll guide the aircraft through, basically by indicating, follow these. There's a sort of a terminology that's used, but to follow the flight plan if it can, and then hands off the control to the neighboring sector controller once it's about to leave the sector of airspace. And during that time, the controller is responsible for the safety of the aircraft, meaning the controller is monitoring all the aircraft in the sector, up to 12 typically, and making sure that no aircraft come within a certain specified distance, which is like this kind of virtual hockey puck around each aircraft, 5-mile lateral separation, 1,000-foot vertical separation in airspace that's outside of kind of busy urban areas where those separation standards are decreased. So it's, as I said, it's a wonderful control problem. It's a multi-agent control problem, safety critical. It's human in the loop, and human in the loop for the foreseeable future. We are automating some things, but there's always, as far as I can see, going to be a human in the loop because we can't anticipate everything that could possibly happen. But we are automating something. So when one automates, one has to think about that human in the loop problem, that it has to not only be safe, but it has to be understandable by the people who are working with this system. And so I'm going to show a couple of examples, but one thread that you'll see throughout this talk is this example of automating collision avoidance. So, or separation assurance, making sure those virtual hockey pucks of each aircraft don't intersect with each other. And that's, basically that's the primary role of air traffic control. Okay, so separation assurance, we talked about the basic structure of the system. This shows a little bit more detail if we zoom into the Oakland Center. So this is the area of airspace around the Bay Area where I live. And if we just look at the Bay Area, there's lots of little airports, but there's 3 main airports, San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose. And the flight patterns into and out of those airports are often, they're impacting each other, especially when there's weather and the runways have to change and you have to land on runways that one would typically take off on. So there's, that's when it's really important to understand what's going on so that the automation and all of the humans in the loop are in sync with that. But what we see here, and the reason I wanted to show this picture, is kind of these different levels. So altitude is used a lot, of course, to separate aircraft, but not so much in the regions away from busy airports. Aircraft are typically flying at altitudes which are optimal at which the air density is optimal for the weight of the aircraft. So typically, aircraft are flying at roughly the same altitude when they're away from, so larger civilian aircraft are flying at roughly the same altitude as each other when they're away from the kind of busy urban airports. And so just to say that when aircraft require some kind of positive control by air traffic control, the controllers will typically separate those aircraft using lateral separation rather than vertical separation, unless the aircraft are either coming into land or taking off and they're changing their altitude anyway. So these show high altitude cross traffic. So you see sort of north, south, east, west traffic, but also the merging traffic. So we've plotted here over a couple of hour period, time-stamped dots, and we've connected those of aircraft coming into, in this case, we're just looking at San Francisco. Okay, so there's a lot of structure in this system. The aircraft are flying on routes that are well-defined. They're like highways in the sky, and there's radar beacons on the ground that are defining those routes. GPS is used, but GPS is the primary source of navigation is still beacons on the ground that define waypoints in the air that the aircraft fly through. Okay, and this is a slide that I just wanted to illustrate more stylistically the key problem of air traffic control. So here we have two routes that are merging together, aircraft coming in on those routes. We've actually spent a lot of time in my research group sitting behind air traffic controllers in the various sectors of the Oakland airspace. The Oakland Air Traffic Control Center's in well, it's in Sacramento now. It used to be in Fremont. And there's one controller responsible for all aircraft in the sector. And it's just really interesting to see how they manage and talk to and then resolve potential conflicts between aircraft if those conflicts are going to occur. So here's a typical thing you'll see in the Oakland Center, which is taking aircraft. This was a sector that takes aircraft from the east and basically merges the routes together to come into the Bay Area airports. So you get a lot of these merging into one. And what air traffic controllers tend to do is, and you can imagine why this makes sense, so you have all these aircraft that are flying. They tend to route aircraft along these single routes, like these highways in the sky, and the aircraft are flying at the same velocity, because it's a lot easier to basically take a number of aircraft, put them on a single route and fly them at the same velocity, and you can basically treat that then like one aircraft. So you simplify the complexity of managing that group. So getting the aircraft on that single route, and then you can ask what are the most critical aircraft, so the ones that are kind of highlighted in red there, the aircraft that are potentially about to lose separation with each other. That requires more attention of the air traffic controller. They're going to try to resolve that conflict, and then they'll try to resolve that conflict in a number of ways. This is a hybrid automaton model that we built of an aircraft under air traffic control by collecting a lot of data of what the aircraft actually did in the airspace versus what their flight plans were. And we saw these different modes of operation. So in the center there, average speed. The aircraft is flying at its average speed, which is optimal for that altitude. If the controller can resolve a potential conflict by speeding the aircraft up or slowing it down a little bit, by about plus or minus 10% of that velocity, it will do that, so not changing the path. But if to resolve the conflict you need a bigger speed variation, then they'll put in a vector, what they call a vector for spacing. So the aircraft will go into a detour, for example, like a shortcut or a triangular deviation from the route to basically affect a slowdown. Because they're not going to change the velocity too much, because then the aircraft is not flying optimally for that altitude and it's a waste of fuel. So the goal is, and this is kind of how a controller gets measured, I guess the metrics, is that a small set of control actions touch each aircraft a minimum number of times. So try to resolve a conflict by trying to route the fewest number of aircraft, or not at all. Basically make it so the aircraft are flying what they want to fly. And this kind of cognitive grouping together, so the most critical group, the second most critical group, this group is not really critical at all because it's already past that potential merge point. So, it looks like a simple problem of routing aircraft, but potentially very challenging, and it's human in the loop. So it's going to stay human. We can think about automating that, but then how would you prove safety of that? So that was the problem we set out to work on. This is just to show you a little bit of the data that we used to identify that model. So this is This is sector 33. This is the sector in the Oakland airspace that the controllers will talk about a little bit with hushed tones, because it's sort of the entry point from the Salt Lake Center into the Oakland Center, and it's where you see two big merging points from the east into the west, and there's a north-south route coming that's at a higher altitude, but still you have to manage those aircraft. And so here you kind of see, we'll play back a little bit of the data that we were using when we were identifying that hybrid model. But one thing we did in that, so that hybrid system that I showed you, it's like a state machine with the continuous dynamics associated with each state, is kind of, you see this affected here. So you'll see aircraft going by, you'll see this, we call this an intruder aircraft coming in from the right-hand side, then an aircraft that's actually around the same altitude coming from north to south, that's a potential conflict with the intruder aircraft. So what you see here is this is what the flight plan was supposed to be. This is what the aircraft actually did, and this is what our model predicted the aircraft would do. So that, that's showing the intervention of air traffic control. Let's just show the data on that. Okay, so you see this aircraft coming in from the top, it's a red aircraft. Here's the aircraft coming in, here's the deviation, and then these aircraft are actually flying at a different altitude, so it goes off the screen. That's, it's not disappearing in real life. Okay, so that was a project that we did fairly early on to identify this model. As you know, it's really important if you're going to start working on a problem to spend a lot of time making sure you understand it, that you understand how the system works now, and identify these models. Okay, and as I said yesterday, this was a slide I had in my talk yesterday, there's been a big push lately to make the airspace a little more flexible, to allow for operations of other kinds of aircraft, not just small general aviation aircraft. Those have been around for a long time, but now automated aircraft that are typically flying at much lower altitudes than the commercial aircraft. But of course, in the low altitude airspace around cities, around airports, they're going to be sharing the airspace. So how does one adapt the current air traffic control system to make it flexible, to allow these aircraft in while maintaining safety for both systems? And then how does one design what's called a UTM, Unmanned Air System Traffic Management, for the UAVs? It's a clean slate, right? It doesn't exist now. So do we keep some of the same highway structure principles when we're designing a UTM? Do we keep the same kinds of hybrid models that are used by controllers in air traffic control? Now there's no pilots in these aircraft. They're flying basically, well, they're flying semi-autonomously. There's businesses that are interacting with the aircraft, but there's a UTM controller or set of controllers on the ground that's managing that group. How do you maintain contact? All sorts of really interesting problems when you're thinking about networks of autonomous systems, of course, both on the ground and in the air. Okay, so I've been referring to something called a hybrid system model rather loosely. This is a kind of modeling paradigm that's been around for quite a long time now. The idea is that one combines discrete state models, like the kind of bubble diagram finite state machine that you see there, with continuous dynamic models that describe the physical processes themselves. So let's take a look at this. I have here a number of discrete states, Q1, Q2, Q3. They have transitions defined from one state to another. Associated to each discrete state is some continuous process, a continuous state process that's defining how the system is evolving in that discrete state. So normal mode, where all aircraft are flying according to their flight plans, we could call that Q1. Air traffic control puts one of the 12 aircraft into an avoid maneuver. So the relative dynamics change for the aircraft that are close by. The continuous dynamics change. It goes into some kind of avoid maneuver. So you could imagine, different dynamics representing the state, the current mode or discrete state of the system. So this is a good model for collision avoidance systems, multi-agent collision avoidance systems. It's been used in a lot of different contexts. It's a good model for the actual flight management system in a modern aircraft, which has a bunch of different control systems, depending on whether you're trying to capture an altitude, capture a vector into an airport. All those are separate control systems, and you switch between those. So you've got the nonlinear dynamics of the aircraft under the control system of, say, mode Q5. Okay, it's also a wonderful representation for large, a robotics control problem, especially, for example, robots where you've got arms or it's walking and you've got this kind of contact and you're switching between free mode and contact. So it's a very general representation. It's been used in a lot of different contexts. We call that hybrid when it's combining discrete state and continuous state models. Okay, so I'm going to spend the remaining part of probably about the next half hour, as I said, going into a little bit of the mathematical detail behind one of the tools that we've been working on in my group to address some of these problems of automating, for example, the collision avoidance problem. That's reachability. I'll explain what that is. I'll talk about the method, and maybe most importantly, I'll talk about the toolbox and the code and how you can download the code and use it. And then I'm going to spend, in the spirit of the computation, I'm going to spend the remaining part of the talk focusing on improving the efficiency of the computation. That's been one of the major challenges in computing reachable sets. It's a technology that's based on the principle of dynamic programming. And thus, for those of you who know about the principle of dynamic programming, which I'll talk about, it's subject to the curse of dimensionality. As you increase the number of continuous states, the computation becomes much more challenging. So how do we address that? What are some tools that we use to, in many cases, just approximate, but still provide us with a solution that we can use for, as I said at the beginning, verifying safety of a control system that we're designing? And please, if there are any questions, feel free to interrupt as we go through this.
Actually, I do have a question. So you talked about the use of ground-based radar that's the primary navigation tool, and then you also mentioned GPS. Is there any talk about combining those information? It'd be easy to implement a data fusion algorithm and combine those in an optimum sense. Is the FAA talking about that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the question is, what's sort of the state of combining this primary ground-based navigation system with GPS and air traffic control? And this is something the answer is yes, it's being done. It's an ongoing project. Or set of projects that the FAA is funding, NASA is funding work in this area. And the idea is to use GPS and to use these VOR, very high frequency omnidirectional range beacons, to combine those. And then to slowly remove potentially some of these VOR beacons from the system because they're expensive to maintain, they're ground-based. If we have a good GPS system that we can rely on, that has that reliability and integrity that you need for an air traffic control system, then we should, of course, use that. As we all know, the problems there are the reliability and the integrity, especially the understanding how the system could be compromised, when it would go out, but also when it could be attacked. And so there's a lot of research going on in this, but this is the direction it's moving. Yeah. I mean, I think from a point of view of control, it has been a very centralized control system. I mean, centralized at the point of view of sectors, that there has been a ground-based controller controlling all of the aircraft. We're getting sensing technologies that are becoming more decentralized, that are aircraft-based, and we should be using those. And so the control problems that you'll see here are very much in that spirit. Okay, backwards reachable set, reachability. So the idea behind reachability, I think it's very intuitive. You have a set of states that you don't want the system to get into, so compute all states from which the system can get into that set and then avoid that set. So I've sort of posed it from the point of view of unsafety. We have a set, let's say it's that red ellipse. This is a set of states in the state space, so X is a vector in Rn, say, for this continuous system. And what I'm assuming here is I can represent unsafety as a subset of the system state space. I call that the set G at time 0. And so that's a good assumption when, in many systems, in these kinds of physical systems, multi-agent systems that we're talking about, where the dynamics, whether they be continuous as in this image, or hybrid, or discrete, or some combination, whether those dynamics, when an unsafe condition can be represented, for example, as the relative distance between any pair of aircraft goes less than 5 nautical miles. So that can be represented as some subset of the overall relative dynamics of that larger group of aircraft. We talked about an autopilot switching modes. Whatever the aircraft does, it has to stay within its aerodynamic flight envelope. That is a set of the system state space. So anything outside that envelope represents an unsafe condition. Robotic systems, the walking systems or robotic arm systems that we're talking about, they have to satisfy certain constraints, which become even more challenging if they're interacting in close proximity with people. So there's, safety constraints. So we're interested in safety constraints that can be represented as a subset of the state space of the system. We have a model. In this case, it's just a continuous differential equation, and I'll show you some results for hybrid systems as well. Continuous state X in Rn, set of inputs U, set of disturbances, things that we don't know but we can bound, or we have to assume we can bound, either deterministically or probabilistically, D, so these are vectors as well. And so what we're computing now in this safety-based system is all states X for which, for all possible control inputs, there exists a disturbance which could drive the system into that set G of 0 in at most T time units. So that's how you characterize that set. If you think about it from a control point of view, what you're doing is you're taking that set and you're back propagating it under the inverse or the negative of these dynamics, meaning that you're calculating states which would, under these dynamics, enter that set, using that best control for worst disturbance point of view. So that's the intuition. It's just states that could potentially go unsafe despite the best possible control action that you can apply. And early on when we were working on this, we showed that you could characterize that set. And I'm saying characterize, not compute. Characterize that set as the solution of a particular Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equation, which is an equation that is a very historical and famous equation in optimal control and dynamic games. It has actually roots from both calculus of variations, one can derive this formulation, or from Bellman's principle of dynamic programming, one can derive this equation. And the intuition is as follows. Represent the set, so your initial data, the thing that you bring into the problem, as a function, as a set of states, implicitly through a function in one higher dimension than your state space. So J is some kind of value function defined over states at time t. And so the set that we're interested in, this backwards reachable set G of t, is those states X such that at any point in time t, this function J is less than 0. So it's the sub-zero level sets of this function J. J itself, we can compute. So J is initialized so that J at time 0 has 0 level set, which is this function. And then you evolve J over space and time using this partial differential equation. So this partial differential equation includes the best control for the worst disturbance. And that's operating on, this is a Hamiltonian. It's the inner product between the outward pointing normal to J at any point x at time t. That's just the gradient, dj by dx. And the dynamics themselves, which are, let's say at this point in time, for the best control over the worst disturbance, F points inwards. So we look at that inner product. In this case, it's an obtuse angle. That means that this is less than 0. So when you take the min with 0, it becomes negative, and the set grows outwards at the next point in time. As you march, in this case, we're computing a backwards reachable set, so time is marching backwards. So that's the kind of point of view we take, and you know, I'm kind of describing in a finite time iterative way how you would solve this PDE. That's in fact how we code up the solvers to solve this. We grid up the state space, and then we compute the solution at every point in time. But we start with the boundary of our initial data, and we work backwards. You can also solve this problem for forwards reachable sets. You can solve it for capture basins, so you know, sets of states that can reach a desired set. This calculation can be moved around in different ways. The min with 0 is what we is our modification to the traditional Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equation. It basically wants to say that if a state has been labeled unsafe at any point in time, it shouldn't become safe at an earlier point in time. It's like if you're burning a field, if a blade of grass is burnt, it can never become unburnt again. So once something has been marked unsafe over that time horizon, it has to stay unsafe as you move backwards in time. So it calculates what's called the reachable tube of states. Okay, so you'd continue this and compute that set. This was some earlier work we did with Ian Mitchell, a former PhD student. Okay, and this level set interpretation. So this function J, as I said, it's a function through which these sets are defined implicitly. All right, so that's nice because you don't have to worry about shapes of sets like ellipsoids or polygons or whatever. It just, you can capture very general sets through this level set functionality. And if we just take a slice of that set, here's our initial data. So J at time 0 over x would be this function. So here's the unsafe region at time 0. And then we basically, through this PDE, we're computing J of xt. It's evolving, and here it is at that time point. Okay, so we're using these level set functions, or they're called implicit surface functions. We're defining G implicitly by this function. Here, instead of calling it J, I'm calling it phi. On this slide, they're the same thing. So G of t is always defined implicitly through the sub-zero level sets of this function phi, and then the surface of the boundary of the set is just the 0 level set itself. All right, so there's some neat things about this, right? If you look at, you know, a snapshot in time, you have this function over x. You can look at the value of phi at x, and you can figure out whether you're outside the set, inside the set, or on the set boundary just by evaluating this function that you've pre-computed at that point x. You can also, depending on how you initialize, what function you use to initialize, because there's many functions you could use, you can also use a distance function, basically. So you can figure out how far you are away at any point in time from the boundary of the set, which kind of represents our boundary of criticality. Because ideally, you know, if you're out here, you'd like to be optimizing fuel or doing something that's not related to safety. You know, I'm not going to hit that vehicle. But if I get close, that means I'm becoming in danger of hitting that vehicle, and I want to start using the control, that max over u from the Hamiltonian, to be able to make sure I stay outside that set. And you have a proof that you can do that as long as your models are good models of the system. As long as, if the model is exact, then you've proven, you have a certification that you have a control which will keep you outside of that set if you start outside of that set for the time horizon that you've computed it for. Okay, so a couple of words about the sets themselves. So we've worked with a bunch of different ways to capture sets. And you know, this has its disadvantages, which is kind of the rest of this talk, which is that you you're doing numerical computations all the time, except, if you've got a linear system with quadratic cost, this reduces to our standard Riccati equation. It's an optimal control problem. But typically, we don't have linear systems with quadratic costs, and we're, solving this numerically. So easy to represent a variety of shapes. It's a uniform framework for many types of dynamics, nonlinear dynamics, controls, disturbances, hybrid dynamics. The surface parameters are easily approximated. Topological changes in shape are automatic. This just shows one of the shapes. And the complexity is, okay, I'll say conceptual complexity. So, of course, computing this depends on the dimension of the continuous state space, but the representation doesn't. It's represented implicitly through this function. Easy to visualize. I put quotes around easy. It's easy to visualize in 2D and 3D. As you get to 4D and 5D or 7D or 10D, you have to start looking at projections of this set if you're interested in visualizing it. Okay, so this is actually a historical example. There was Rufus Isaacs, who was a game theorist working at the Rand Corporation, kind of in the post-war era in Santa Monica. And that Hamilton-Jacobi equation that I showed earlier, I called it Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman. It's actually incorrect. If you have just a control input, it's called the Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equation. If you have a control and a disturbance input, it's called the Hamilton-Jacobi-Isaacs equation typically, because Isaacs was the one who actually went through and did this solution, based on Bellman's solution for when you have this game, when you have a control playing against a disturbance. So here's two aircraft. This is a dogfight scenario, which is not what they do in air traffic control. But if you don't know, like if you have some uncertainty about the actions of other aircraft, it's a framework that you can use to basically compute the worst case given the uncertainty that you have. So in this case, here's the control aircraft. We're going to assume that the linear velocities, so the linear velocity of the control aircraft and the linear velocity of the disturbance aircraft are given. And we'll make the inputs the angular velocity. So angular velocity of control, angular velocity of the disturbance aircraft. We can assume, so in this dogfight, this aircraft is trying to get inside a 5-mile radius of the control aircraft. And this aircraft is trying to make sure that that aircraft stays outside that region. The dynamics in each case, here we're using 3-dimensional kinematic models. It's what is typically called a Dubin's car model for the vehicles. So they're flying, and the nonlinearity comes in through the angle, the relative angle phi of one aircraft with respect to another. So x1 is the relative x position, x2 is the relative y position, and then the relative heading is x3 in this model. Okay, so this is a relative dynamic model based on that Dubin's car. Control input is bounded, disturbance input is bounded. We just put unity bounds on that so they can change their angular velocity. And so here, the calculation, the initial set, j at time 0, is just a cylinder in the x, y relative heading space. That records the fact that, if aircraft come within 5 nautical miles of each other, regardless of the heading, that's going to be an unsafe condition. And then we just compute the backwards reachable set. So this is an old computation. It's one of the first ones we did when we were working on this. This is this toolbox code. I'll say a few words about that, but this is done in MATLAB. The maximum unsafe condition actually makes sense. It's when the aircraft have a relative heading of 180 degrees, meaning the aircraft are flying towards each other. If the aircraft are pointing away, like in a line, so they either have a heading of 0 or equivalently 2 pi, that's the maximally safe condition. They're flying at, depending on what the linear velocity is, you can make that absolutely safe. And so you see this kind of outgrowth that spirals around the set. Let's just visualize that with a little, kind of like a video game, how you might actually use this. So control aircraft at the origin of the relative frame, disturbance aircraft outside. Here's a slice of that 3D set, again, visualized here. for the relative heading of the two aircraft. So here the relative heading is pretty much 180 degrees. So you see the slice is at its maximal point at pi. And so what I said is that as long as this aircraft starts outside of that set, this aircraft always has a control strategy which will keep that red aircraft outside of that set. And so here we just played that back, and we said when this aircraft is trying to get to that aircraft in this simulation, this aircraft is trying to move to the right-hand side of the screen, but it's going to filter what it does. So it's like a collision avoidance filter when this aircraft gets close to its boundary. All right, so inside or unsafe, outside or safe, because they're controllably safe, you can apply the appropriate control action. And here you see that aircraft moving, the blue aircraft, according to the best possible control for the worst disturbance. Okay, so it can do that because we had a certificate of verification for that initial state. So you see that set changes depending on the relative heading, and that's that simulation. In this case, the red aircraft starts inside. They don't have to collide, but if that red aircraft does its worst possible thing, they will collide, or they will lose separation. It'll come in that protected zone, and in this case it does. All right, so you see that illustration of what that set actually means and how you might use it as a filter. All right, so this is Ian Mitchell. He's the one that designed the toolbox. You can download the toolbox. And it's, as I said yesterday, Ian's really good at documenting the code, providing good examples that you can download, run his examples, pull his examples out, put your dynamics in, and do these computations. Since Ian published this several years ago, we in my group have been building up kind of tools to wrap around the toolbox to make it a lot easier to use. So this helper OC toolbox. This is Mo Chen and Sylvia Herbert. Mo just graduated, and he's now an assistant professor also in Vancouver at Simon Fraser University. And Sylvia is a PhD student currently in my group. And there's a lot of sort of things to make the use of this toolbox easier, to enter dynamics, to use different kinds of Hamiltonian functions, et cetera. And so it's kind of a wrapper, and you can also go and download this toolbox from our lab's GitHub site. Okay, so now let's spend a little bit of time talking about examples, and then we'll conclude the talk by talking about higher dimensions. All right, so closely spaced parallel approaches. This is a wonderful two-aircraft collision avoidance problem. This is a sky shot of San Francisco, 4 runways. Runways are really close together. So basically, if aircraft are going to come in and land in parallel, it has to be a nice day where both pilots can see each other. And here we were standing here at this point, and we were taking photographs. United has a hub in San Francisco. So typically, the air traffic controllers will route United aircraft into these closely spaced parallel approaches because the pilots know each other. They actually have to formally hand off control to the pilots because the aircraft are so close together. And the pilots take over control of the landing. But if it's a foggy day, they won't do this at all. They basically treat this like one runway, and the aircraft are staggered by a certain distance. So we were wondering about using this kind of collision avoidance technology as an automated system in this kind of closely spaced parallel approach problem, especially to alleviate congestion on foggy days, which is, let's face it, like most of the summer in San Francisco. So we did that. There's certain modifications, again, human-in-the-loop system. So you don't want to have, touch the reachable set and apply that optimal control, and it changes for slight, changes in relative configuration. You basically want to have 3 simple maneuvers. So prescribe the control ahead of time. We prescribed 3. 3 emergency escape maneuvers. So the evading aircraft either accelerates straight ahead. This would be appropriate if it were actually in front of the other vehicle. Accelerate and turn to the right by 45 degrees. Accelerate and turn stay at the same velocity and make a sharper turn to the right. And of course, if it were on the other side, it would be equivalent, just the opposite symmetry. So for each of these emergency escape maneuvers, we computed a reachable set, and we took the intersection. So here's the boundary of maneuver 1, boundary for maneuver 2, boundary for maneuver 3. So then you carry around this set with you. And when the other aircraft that's coming in, suppose it blunders. As soon as it moves in such a way that the evader first touches the boundary, you apply that maneuver, which that set is specifically computed for. So those 1 of 3 maneuvers. And that kind of complies with what air traffic control does now for missed approaches. There's a procedure. If you can't land for a particular airport, you follow a prescribed missed approach in air traffic control. All right, so we computed these reachable sets. This is an earlier version of our experimental platform here. So we have these 2 fixed wing, they're about 10-foot wingspan. The electronics are in the fuselage. We designed this GPS, the navigation system is based on a differential GPS. Yeah, and we fly at Moffett Field, and there's a bird sanctuary like in the bay right next to it. So we're not avoiding we're avoiding the birds, but not by the automated system. That's a whole other problem in itself. Okay, so these 2 aircraft, they're taking off. We take them off manually, and then we switch when they're at altitude to the collision avoidance maneuver. And I don't know if you were following this, but one of the aircraft blunders into the path of the first, and then that reachable set we've pre-computed because we've pre-computed the emergency escape maneuvers, and it just carries it along with it. And then as soon as the other vehicle touches it, it follows that emergency escape maneuver. So that set is the certificate of safety here, as long as we trust the models that we use to compute it. We flew this on Boeing aircraft. This is so this is an F-15. This is a T-33 test aircraft. These were piloted aircraft, but during the sorties, when they were effecting that collision avoidance maneuver, the pilots were hands-off. Well, this pilot was hands-on, but this aircraft was running, our laptop was in there, connected to the autopilot, running this same collision avoidance system. And so we did a number of sorties. You're kind of seeing the playback of the data here. The T-33 test aircraft was basically responding automatically to manual blunders of that F-15 pilot. So that's cool, right? Going from pencil and paper to simulations in the lab to flight tests on lab-based aircraft to flying them on Boeing aircraft. That's the kind of thing I love doing. It takes a long time. So when we started this project, we did this flight test about 7 years after we started the project. But the student who did it came in after 2 years and had the whole PhD thesis from conceptualization through to flight tests on the Boeing platform. Okay. As I said, you can also use this technology to capture desired configurations. You just switch the min and the max in the Hamilton-Jacobi equation, and you can do hybrid systems. So I had this slide yesterday, reaching a desired target through a sequence of mode switches while avoiding an unsafe region. So all this kind of set-based manipulation is fairly easy when you're using implicit surface functions to represent sets. Shall I show this? I'm going to show this example really quickly. We play, so we have a sort of human-robot collaboration. This is now with our quad rotors on campus, where we're playing Capture the Flag, which is a game, turns out, played by a lot of undergraduates on university campuses on weekends and during the evenings. So I didn't know this until I became a professor. I had a sheltered undergraduate life. But what we did was we made a team out of a quad rotor and a person. And it's hard, right? Because you have to know where the other team's flag is. Then you have to get the flag. And you have to return to your safe area, not knowing, you can't see through buildings. So we use this to compute. So we had a human teaming up with a quad rotor. Quad rotor, of course, can get a bird's eye view, but you have to know where to guide the quad rotor. You have to know where the kind of winning sets are for you and figure out if the other player is there and can tag you before you get to your safe zone. So it's a nice litmus test for these kinds of problems. All right, so we have the goal. The attacker is the one who's got the flag now. This is the UC Berkeley flagpole. And he's going back to the goal here. There's a defender guarding the goal. The red sets, so you see these sort of reach-avoid regions. This is the red sets represent where the defender can be for the current attacker configuration and win. And the blue sets are the attacker winning region, where the attacker can be. And we're using models for the speed they can run at and stuff. But the attacker and the defender don't know where each other, where the other is. And there's a visibility, so you see this visibility region, okay? But the attacker here has the advantage. It has a quad rotor, and it's also, we set this up, the people playing the game have cell phones with these reachability calculations being done on a server and sent to them on the cell phone. So they can see as soon as you know where the other player is, you know where your winning and losing regions are. Okay, so we did this, and I'll just show a little bit of this video because it goes on a little bit. But here's the attacker, he's got the flag, he's controlling our quad rotor, and we'll just show a little bit of that playback. Here's the sort of camera attached to the attacker, but he's moving around, and he's figuring out, where he has to be so he can win, but he has to find out where the defender is. And so he knows where the defender can be. There's only some subset of the region that he's really interested in because he's already computed where the defender could be and he won't win. So he's going to go look. The sort of reachability calculation guides where he's going to send the quad rotor to go and look for the defender. Okay, and basically, not surprisingly, he wins the game. He gets back to his flag region. Okay, other people have worked on this problem, not just our lab. Here's a number of other labs. I keep hitting the wrong button. Domitila Del Vecchio at MIT has been using reachability for some trajectory optimization problems for helicopters. Aaron Ames's group on walking robots. Ram Vasudevan's group, again on walking robots. Shahab Kanama, Miko Oishi, and Ian Mitchell are working on some anesthesia delivery problems, all model-based control problems where you can use reachability. And the biggest problem in this computation, apart from the fact that often you don't know your models and you have to learn them, is this curse of dimensionality. So let me just end the talk, really in the last few minutes, saying a few words about what we've done there. Okay, curse of dimensionality. And I think, in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip to talk a little bit about this last topic I had proposed, which is how you might use decompositions to make that curse of, to basically take a large dimensional system and break it down into a number of smaller dimensional systems where you can compute those reachable sets in parallel. We've done a number of other things. We've got another toolbox or another sort of wrapper around the toolbox to now encode this in C++ instead of MATLAB. That did a lot. Okay, we're going to skip that and go over to system decomposition. Okay, and so I'm going to describe the basic idea here. If the slides will advance. Maybe I won't. Okay, it seems that the slides are just telling me to stop here. So I'm going to describe the idea just using this slide. All right, so what is this a picture of? So suppose you had, in this case, a three-dimensional system. This is not something that you would want to use any kind of decomposition for because we can compute three-dimensional reachable sets in real time. But suppose, just for the sake of illustration, that you could take your target set and you could compute the projection of the target set onto some lower dimensional subspaces, do the reachable set computation independently in each of the subspaces, and then back project that resulting set, and then compute, again, the intersection of the back projection. This gives us in a lot of cases, approximate or over-approximate, and in many cases, interestingly, an exact reconstruction of that reachable set in a fraction of the time, because it's much easier to compute like a number of two-dimensional computations and then stitch them together, versus one 3-dimensional computation. Well, here, 2 to 3 isn't a big deal. But where we can use this is, for example, in some of those 10-dimensional computations that I showed. We've worked on a 12-dimensional computation where the actual core computations we're doing are a number in 3 dimension, and then we back project and compute the set in higher dimensions. And so the idea behind decomposition is to look for a structure within the differential equation so that we can construct self-contained subsystems. Basically, the evolution of the states in each subsystem is governed by just the dynamics in those subsystems themselves. And so in our recent work, and this is a paper that we published earlier this year in the Transactions on Automatic Control, we showed what kinds of classes of systems you could perform this decomposition on, how you would do the decomposition, and basically the proof of whether you're getting either an approximate or an exact representation of the reachable set. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what happened with the slides. I had some animations showing you how that works. But I think it's more appropriate, since we're closer to the end of the talk anyway, to end the talk there and to thank a number of people who've worked on this with me over the years, mainly students and postdocs, and our funding agencies, which has, in the past, it's been DARPA and ONR, and now and the NSF funding this, and to thank you for your attention during this talk. Thank you very much. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yes, are there any questions for Claire? Yes.
So thank you for your talk. My question is how the accuracy of the model affects the computation of the reachable set?
How does the accuracy of the model affect the computation of the reachable set? It does, because that reachable set depends, it's a dynamic set, it depends on the dynamics. So the more roughly in a kind of rule of thumb, the more complex the model, the more complex the reachable set looks. Of course, the higher the dimension, the reachable set will be in that dimension. What we typically try to do is we try to create the simplest possible model that gives us the least conservative set that we can work with. So you saw me using, in the example, 3-dimensional models of aircraft, which are actually typically pretty good models of commercial aircraft flying at altitude. If it starts changing altitude, you need to include the longitudinal dynamics of the aircraft as well. For our UAV traffic management system, which I talked about yesterday, we're using 7-dimensional models of the UAVs. They're both fixed wing and quad rotors. They're different models because they're flying close together, and you need that complexity. And we actually use this decomposition to be able to do those 7-dimensional calculations in real time. So with the simpler models, what we tend to do is we under-approximate the capability of the control, and we over-approximate the capability of the disturbance to make sure that even if the model is not an exact representation, it's a conservative representation for safety. Question?
Can you talk a little bit more about the intuition of choosing the level set functions? Because it seems to me that when we represent a set function with potentially very complex geometry with bound constraints using scalars, it seems to me that we're necessarily losing information. How?
No, you're not losing any information, because the function j of xt it can get quite complicated. It can look quite complicated as it evolves, or even, it depends how you initialize it as well. Typically, we've got circles or ellipses or squares that we start with, and then as we evolve those, they become, they could become disconnected. So you have a piece of a set that breaks off. But then you can imagine, then you have a function j which has this kind of shape. That shape is just governed by the dynamics of the system and how the control and the disturbance affect it. So the fact that you're using this function j over the state space, you remember it's a function over the state and over time. So it's changing over the state space as time evolves. And so, and the function itself is, it could have quite complex shape, which allow you to capture quite complex sets. Often non-intuitive as well, which is fun, because then you look back and then it becomes intuitive once you see the answer. Games are often that way. Yeah.
Aside from the amount of time that you reach back, what keeps these sets finite? What guarantees that you can have that initial?
Yeah, that's a good point. Largely, it's the time horizon you compute it for. But in some cases, the sets do actually close off after some finite time, and then they don't grow anymore, despite, even if you keep computing backwards. And so an example of that would be, like, you know, in that Isaac's example that I showed, if you give the control much more authority, like instead of making it the same as like +1, -1 on that angular velocity example we were looking at, say you make it +2 and -2, but you keep the disturbance at +1 and -1. So immediately the control has more turning authority and that set closes. I mean, that's an example where the set would close off. Typically that, I mean, that may be a little bit of a rule of thumb. It depends on the dynamics, it depends on the control versus disturbance authority. But typically you don't get them closing off, and you do the computation for a finite horizon, which makes sense in most practical applications because you're only looking at some finite horizon and then you're in a new situation with new aircraft. So you've got these horizons that you're computing for. And you want to make sure that before you get to the end of the previous horizon, you've done your computation for the next horizon, kind of like in a model predictive control framework.
Okay, since we are out of time, I'll defer the other questions. You can come up front and talk to Claire afterwards. Let's thank our speaker, Claire Tomlin, again.
Thank you very much.